So often I'll be like, this cocktail needs something, and then just reach straight for the Amontillado because it's basically ready-made complexity. Sherry is amazing because it brings a really unique flavour, so it can be used to add another dimension to a host of classic cocktails, or it can be built on for a beautiful custom creation. Although, of course, very good, very old sherry will be expensive, you can easily invest in a good quality sherry for half the cost of most spirits and liqueurs, and it expands your repertoire exponentially. It is also lower ABV than spirits, but higher than wine, so it has enough backbone to carry the dilution of a cocktail, but you can have two instead of one. Are you thinking of your grandmother's sherry? Then you had better stop that right now. Regular viewers will know I'm forever espousing the wonders of sherry. It's an amazing secret weapon in your cocktail making arsenal. I'm going to take you through what exactly sherry is, the different styles of it, and how best to use it, while having a little taste, of course. I can't resist using sherry in cocktails, so if that appeals to you, then hit that subscribe button and the notification bell because we've got more sherry cocktails coming your way soon. So what is sherry? Sherry is, very basically, a fortified wine which is made in a specific region of Spain. So fortified means a wine which has had spirit added to it to give it a higher alcohol content. It does not necessarily mean that sugar has been added to it. In fact, contrary to popular belief, the majority of sherries are dry. They are aged white wines which develop massive complexity due to the distinctive aging process. Now, sherry must be made in the south of Spain in an area of Andalusia known as the Sherry Triangle. So that's a little area between the towns of Jerez, El Puerto de Santa Maria and Sanlúcar de Barrameda. As a side note, it is an amazingly beautiful region, and if anyone gets the chance to visit, then you definitely should. It's absolutely my happy place. The unique soils and climate here are perfect for growing the three grapes that sherry is made from: Palomino, Pedro Ximénez, and the lesser used Moscatel. For a long time, it was thought that sherry had to be made there because of the particular climate and conditions causing the very important flor, which is a layer of yeast, and there'll be more on this later, to form. However, winemakers have since disproved this, and you can find sherry style wines made in a lot of wine producing regions now, although they can't be called sherry, much like how sparkling wines made outside of champagne are not in fact champagne. Often they will be labelled by the style of sherry that they're closest to, so for instance Fino or Oloroso, or folks can get a little bit creative with names, like here in Australia they've come up with the word apera for their sherry-like wines. A common feature of these wines is that they will be aged in a Solera system. This is something that they do in rum production a lot as well. And it basically just means that barrels are topped up with newer wines as older wine is taken out to be bottled. So this is why you'll see some bottles of sherry with crazily old dates like 1842 written on them, because that's how long that Solera has been going for. Of course, the amount of sherry from that year would be pretty diluted by now, but it's still cool to be able to drink something with such a long pedigree. Because sherries are made from the same few grapes, the flavour differences actually mostly come from the production and aging processes. So it's helpful to break this rather large subject down into two categories. You've got dry sherry and sweet sherry. Dry sherries are made from Palomino grapes, which are fermented to make a dry white wine, which is actually generally kind of fairly flavourless. They're trying to add all the flavour afterwards in the production process. So this base wine is tasted and classified according to its flavour profile, and this is where the flor comes in. It's a layer of yeast that forms over the top of the wine. When the wine is fortified past a certain point, this yeast layer won't form because the higher alcohol level kills it off. So really good, delicate base wines with lots of floral characteristics will be earmarked for biological or non-oxidative aging, and they're fortified less, which allows that layer to form, whereas more robust base wines will be earmarked for oxidative aging and have more alcohol added. Now, what the hell does that mean? Well, oxidative refers to oxygen in the air, so it's just talking about whether or not the wine will be aged open to the air or not. Have you ever opened a bottle of white wine for cooking and popped it in the cupboard and completely forgotten about it? Because I've done that plenty. And it changes heaps. It gets much darker and starts to taste more like kind of dried fruit and even nuts and mushrooms rather than that bright, fresh citrus and stone fruits when it's fresh. So that's the effect of oxygen getting in there. So this process can be delayed but not stopped entirely by storing things in the fridge, which is why I'm always nagging at you to keep your vermouth and sherry cold once you've opened them. So the lighter, brighter wines will be aged under this layer of yeast, the flor, to protect them from the effects of oxygen. On the other hand, the effect of oxygen actually enhances the coarser wines because it allows them to develop really amazing depth of flavour and complexity. The flor can also die naturally or be killed off deliberately during the maturation process, and that creates a really interesting in-between style. So in the category of dry sherry, you have an incredible range of flavour profiles, and hopefully you're starting to see why they are such useful flavour enhancers for cocktails. But before I get into that, we do need to chat about the sweet sherries. Sweet sherries can be made in a couple of ways. The most intense ones will be made by late harvesting Pedro Ximénez or Moscatel grapes and then drying them in the sun. So picking them later means that the grapes will be really ripe and full of sugar, and then drying them turns them into raisins, basically. So you can see why pouring a PX can sometimes feel like pouring a glass of oil. Since fermentation is the process of turning sugar into alcohol, their fermentation is actually cut short to retain a lot of that sugar, and then the alcohol is bumped up via fortification. Older PX is literally some of the most powerful and intriguing sips I've ever had in my life, because allowing something that already has that much inherent character to develop over time is always going to absolutely blow your mind. Now, the other way of making sweet wine is to take a dry base wine, so one made with Palomino, and then blend it with PX or Moscatel or just a concentrated grape syrup. And this is your grandmother's sherry. This is the cheapest way of making sweet sherry, and while it definitely has its place, so I love a Lustau East India cream sherry after dinner, it is the one that was often left to languish in a cupboard to be dusted off each Christmas day for years in a row. I just wanted to take a little moment to say a really heartfelt thanks to our patron angels, those that have supported us on the Patreon page so far. So to Evan, Jay, Hannah, David, and Barclay, thank you so much. It's really lovely to be able to just have a little bit of light-hearted content and share some booze knowledge with other people that care about it in these somewhat troubled times. We plan on doing it for as long as possible, and your support is helping to make that happen, so thank you. So I'm going to taste through these and describe them from the lightest and brightest to richest and heaviest. So starting with your Fino and Manzanilla. So Fino and Manzanilla are the same base wine, but then just aged in different areas. So Manzanilla is in Sanlúcar de Barrameda, which is by the sea, and the cooler and more constant climate there allows a really thick layer to form. This means it's really light and delicate and lively, but it does have kind of a maritime salty edge to it, and also notes of yeast from the flor layer. The word Manzanilla actually means chamomile, which is another classic flavor note. It's actually my favorite style. I'm not drinking it today. I'm just gonna have some Fino, but I could literally drink one this big. It's in my absolute favorite cocktail, the Jabberwocky, and it really elevates this wet martini. Or you can try it in a margarita, because we know that tequila loves salt. I like to add a little spike to Bloody Marys for an awesome maritime punch. So this one is the Lustau Fino Girana. Fino is literally the inland twin of Manzanilla, and I find it much more herbal and a little bit less saline because it doesn't have that kind of maritime influence, but they are very similar. So it's really quite soft. You get a really lovely bready note from it, and quite citrus as well, which is why it goes so well with gin. You should check out the London Calling video for more on that. If martinis are more your thing, if you don't like shaking things up, then try out Tuxedo. It's a really awesome lower ABV martini style drink. Or just add a Fino rinse to any of your favorite gin and vermouth combinations and watch it sing. You can see it's very, very slightly darker than your average white wine, just because obviously it does have that Solera system, but it's still really light and crisp, easy drinking, with just a very kind of slight but really delicious, almost medicinal edge. It does have a really lovely herbal dryness, and that's why it works so well actually in tiki drinks as a way of balancing out all of that tropical sweetness. At Bomba, we actually like to use it as a base for like a lower ABV Collins style drink, like the Patsy Collins that we did a video on. Just make sure that you choose one. This one's actually probably a little bit delicate. Make sure you choose one that's really robust and a little bit more fruit forward, and then it can stand up and won't over dilute. Just pack as much ice in there as you can. Both Manzanilla and Fino need to be crisp and clean, so even storing them in the fridge, they will only last a couple of weeks or a month maximum. Mine never last that long anyway. But luckily they do quite often come in little smaller 375ml or 500ml bottles. So moving on to that really fun in-between style, you have Amontillado or Palo Cortado. I'm gonna have a little taste of the Amontillado. This is a very interesting halfway house. Some wines are chosen to have their floor killed off at some point along the way of their aging. So this means that they have all the kind of herbal and bready flavors of a Fino, but with an amazing structure and length. So you're starting to get that kind of a little bit raisiny and almost golden syrup sort of nose coming through. It gets a little bit nutty. And this one's probably not old enough. I'm not getting heaps, but sometimes they can go almost slightly smoky, like a little bit tobacco-ish. Anyway, so often I'll be like, this cocktail needs something, and then just reach straight for the Amontillado because it's basically ready-made complexity. But it still has such a nice, bright, dry finish. So it's really rum's best friend. It's amazing in tiki drinks or stir-down boozy numbers alike. That said, it doesn't overpower gin in small quantities because it's not as kind of big and bold as the other ones we're going to look at. And it also works with tequila and whiskey. So if you can only have one sherry, then this might be the one to go for. It's also awesome as the backbone for a sherry cobbler, or you can add a splash to a hot toddy for a little bit of nutty warmth. Anyway, because it has been aged oxidatively, you can see it's really quite dark in colour, so it can stand being left open for quite a while as those more mature flavours are just going to continue developing. So the other kind of wine in this sort of halfway house style are Palo Cortados, but they're anomalies. They were wines that were destined to be a Fino or a Manzanilla, but for some natural reason their floor dies off. Unlike Amontillados, which are always destined to be an Amontillado, and then they have alcohol added to kill their floor deliberately. So Palo Cortados actually get their name from the cross drawn on the barrel, basically meaning this wine is doing its own thing. Let's just see what happens. So they were amongst the most delicate and refined of the base wines, but then they go on to develop all of the texture and body of an Oloroso. So they're absolutely incredible. And it means that they can be used in place of a Fino or a Manzanilla in cocktails like a Bamboo or a Rebujito, and they add an incredible depth of flavour. But you're also seeing more and more bartenders building drinks around their profile because it is so strange and awesome. So something like the Palo Negra, which combines the sherry with rum and tequila and orange liqueur. Sounds pretty weird, but it works. And then this brings us on to the category of wines which is aged entirely oxidatively, and that is Oloroso. Oloroso sherry is made from the most robust of the base wines and aged entirely without a protective floor layer. So you can see this one and this one are probably around the same age, but this has been aged underfloor, and the only reason this is this color is because it doesn't have the floor. So it means that it's really full-bodied and it gives the impression of a bit of a raisiny sweetness, even though it is still a dry wine. So it has lots of nutty notes, especially walnuts, and a lot of kind of baking spices, but also quite a green vegetal edge, sort of thyme and sage coming in there. It works really well with darker spirits because it can even stand up to a slightly smoky scotch in the Artist Special. And it's also great in sweeter dessert style cocktails like the Creamy Sherry Flip because it does have that upfront sweetness but then a really dry finish, so it stops them becoming too cloying. So now that you know what to do with the dry sherries, what about the sweet? Can they also work in cocktails? So your grandma's sherry actually comes into its own in cocktails. In fact, I should have it in a glass that my grandmother would be proud of. They're way less viscous and intense than the other sweet sherries, so they're much more flexible. You still have that real kind of raisiny sweetness, but it does actually have, like, you can feel quite a high acid there. And yeah, as I said, it's just not as much of a kind of coating your mouth situation. One of my favorites is the East India Negroni. So that switches out gin for rum and vermouth for cream sherry. So you get a really rich and spicy take on the bitter classic. And your cream sherries also work really well in Manhattan variations. So again, a PX would just be too much to use in a traditional Manhattan ratio. So that brings us on to the richest of them all, PX. Now, these wines are delicious, but so intense that they can be hard to balance. You can see it's really quite thick, and this isn't even one of the thicker ones. So I definitely recommend using less than you think to begin with. That said, they have amazing dark and dried fruit and chocolate and spice. So it pairs really well with dark spirits. Just try using it instead of sugar syrup in an old fashioned, and you'll find it actually really brings out a lot of the tropical fruit notes in the whiskey. Weirdly, I actually also enjoy a little splash of this in a Bloody Mary, because you do need a little bit of sweetness in there to balance all the savory flavors going on, but do choose this or Manzanilla and not both. Finally, we do have Moscatel, which is basically the same as PX, but just made with different grapes. So it's a bit brighter and think more kind of golden raisins, candied citrus peel, and flowers. Again, you would just want to use this in the place of a sweetener, and I find it does go really well alongside lighter rums, but it is a bit harder to get your hands on, and as you see, I actually couldn't manage it for today. Hopefully, you can now feel confident grabbing a bottle of sherry and experimenting. Please drop me a comment and let me know if you come up with anything great or if you just have any questions. Sherry, so now you know.